Part 3, Aimé Césaire and the Discourse on Colonialism. This brings us to the figure of Aimé Césaire, the great Martinican writer, activist, and statesman, one of the key organic intellectuals of African origin from the Caribbean, identified by Cedric Robinson as particularly influential in developing what would become the distinctive Black Marxist tradition. As Robin Kelley has eloquently put the point in his brilliant, albeit problematic introduction to the text, Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism might be best described as a declaration of war. Kelley goes on to set the scene in a most vivid, indeed gripping style, worthy of quoting at some length. Discourse speaks in revolutionary cadences, capturing the spirit of its age, just as Marx and Engels did 102 years earlier in their little manifesto. First published in 1950 as Discourse sur le colonialisme, it appeared just as the old empires were on the verge of collapse, thanks in part to a world war against fascism that left Europe in material, spiritual, and philosophical shambles. It was the age of decolonization and revolt in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. 5 years earlier, in 1945, Black people from around the globe gathered in Manchester, England, for the 5th Pan-African Congress to discuss the freedom and future of Africa. 5 years later, in 1955, representatives from the non-aligned nations gathered in Bandung, Indonesia, to discuss the freedom and future of the Third World. Mao's revolution in China was a year old, while the Mau Mau in Kenya were just gearing up for an uprising against their colonial masters. The French encountered insurrections in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Cameroon, and Madagascar, and suffered a humiliating defeat by the Viet Minh at Dien Bien and Phu. Revolt was in the air. India, the Philippines, Guyana, Egypt, Guatemala, South Africa, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Harlem, you name it. Revolt. Malcolm X once described this extraordinary moment, this long decade from the end of the Second World to the late 1950s, as a tidal wave of color. Kelley continues, Discourse on Colonialism is indisputably one of the key texts in this tidal wave of anti-colonial literature produced during the post-war period, works that include W.E.B. Du Bois's Color and Democracy from 1945, and The World in Africa from 1947, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, 1952, George Padmore's Pan-Africanism or Communism, The Coming Struggle for Africa, 1956, Albert Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized, 1957, Richard Wright's White Man Listen, 1957, Jean-Paul Sartre's essay, Black Orpheus, 1948, and journals such as Présence Africaine and African Revolution. The discourse begins with an eloquent denunciation of Europe as nothing short of indefensible, in which he centers as the two major unresolved problems of European civilization, the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. In Césaire's words, a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. A civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. The fact is that the so-called European civilization, Western civilization, as it has been shaped by 2 centuries of bourgeois rule, is incapable of solving the 2 major problems to which its existence has given rise, the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. That Europe is unable to justify itself either before the bar of reason or before the bar of conscience, and that increasingly it takes refuge in a hypocrisy which is all the more odious because it is less and less likely to deceive. Europe is indefensible. In his introduction, Kelley seeks to downplay the importance of the European proletariat in the discourse by noting that throughout the text, it remains practically invisible. Nevertheless, the specter of the proletariat haunts the text, its messianic potential to deliver the time of the now, as Benjamin might put it, by fulfilling its promised role as revolutionary subject, is not, but is in fact explicitly appealed to in the text's famous final passage, where its specter reemerges in the body of the text. This is a point to which we shall return, but it is worth taking preliminary note of here, among other reasons because it distinguishes the prophetic message of Césaire's discourse from the clarion call issued by his most distinguished disciple, Frantz Fanon, who who in the concluding passages of The Wretched of the Earth would urge his readers to, quote, leave this Europe where they are never done talking of man, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets, in all the corners of the globe. Even so, Kelly is certainly right to emphasize in his introduction that by elevating the so-called colonial problem to the status of co-foundational, alongside the problem of the proletariat, for European civilization, Césaire was attempting to revise Marx along the lines of predecessors such as the African-American W.E.B. Du Bois and the Indian Manabendra Nath Roy. Though Kelly overstates the point by claiming that Césaire is suggesting that the anti-colonial struggle supersedes the proletarian revolution as the fundamental historical movement of the period. To the contrary, Césaire holds on to the hope that the revolt of the colonies and the revolution of the European proletariat were bound dialectically, destined to be detonated together, intimately and intrinsically, indeed inevitably, causally connected. Such was his lingering faith in the classic Marxist-Leninist prophecy of the imminent arrival of world revolution. So no, Kelly misleads when he argues that for Césaire, the coming revolution was not posed in terms of capitalism versus socialism, but in terms of the complete and total overthrow of a racist colonialist system that would open the way to imagine a whole new world. To the contrary, for Césaire, each side of this equation presupposes, helps instigate, and necessarily requires the unfolding of the other. Césaire's vision of a dialectical intertwining of developments in Europe with those in the colonies is first treated in the form of his sketch of how colonialism works to decivilize the colonizer, in the course of which he would repeatedly invert and subvert the binary terms civilization and savagery. Between colonization and civilization, Césaire would insist, there is an infinite distance. More precisely, he would contend, colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. And thus he would conclude, the continent proceeds towards savagery. He here echoes the disjuncture first identified by the great revolutionary internationalist martyr Rosa Luxemburg, who a generation earlier, just before the dawn of fascism, in her important 1916 Junius pamphlet, penned from prison, had so incisively posed and juxtaposed the alternative path from the crossroads that was the calamity of the so-called Great War to be socialism or barbarism. Barbarism it was, a barbarism that was overdetermined, that was bound to arrive in the form of a boomerang, Césaire would add, in his most emphatic articulation filled with pathos. And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is wakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, how strange. But never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted upon them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. Indeed, Césaire would go on to accuse, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against a man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, the Negroes of Africa. In sum, according to Césaire, colonization dehumanizes even the most civilized man. Colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it. The colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. It is this result, this boomerang effect of colonization, that I wanted to point out. As Malcolm X might put the point, the chickens had come home to roost. Phrased in Young's more academic formulation, fascism was but a form of colonialism brought home to Europe. Césaire thus draws a direct link between the logic of colonialism and the rise of fascism. In this respect, Kelly quite cogently contends it is worth situating Césaire's argument within a larger context of radical Black intellectuals who had come to the same conclusions before the publication of Discourse. Indeed, as Cedric Robinson has argued, a group of radical Black intellectuals, including W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, and Oliver Cox, understood fascism not as some aberration from the march of progress, an unexpected right-wing turn, but a logical development of Western civilization itself. They viewed fascism as a blood relative of slavery and imperialism, global systems rooted not only in capitalist political economy, but racist ideologies that were already in place at the dawn of modernity. Or perhaps more precisely, they viewed racist ideology and racialized subjugation as a constitutive feature of the capitalist world system. Indeed, as Kelly aptly elaborates, as early as 1936, Ralph Bunche, then a radical political science professor at Harvard University, suggested that imperialism gave birth to fascism. The doctrine of fascism, wrote Bunche, with its extreme jingoism, its exaggerated exaltation of the state, and its comic opera glorification of race, has given a new and greater impetus to the policy of world imperialism, which had conquered and subjected to systematic and ruthless exploitation virtually all of the darker populations of the earth. Du Bois made some of the clearest statements to this effect. Quote, I knew that Hitler and Mussolini were fighting communism and using race prejudice to make some white people rich and all colored people poor. But it was not until later that I realized that the colonialism of Great Britain and France had exactly the same object and methods as the fascists and the Nazis were trying clearly to use. Later in The World in Africa, 1947, he writes, there was no Nazi atrocity, concentration camps, wholesale maiming and murder, defilement of women, or ghastly blasphemy of childhood, which Christian civilization or Europe had not long been practicing against colored folk in all parts of the world in the name of and for the defense of a superior race born to rule the world. And with this, we come to the heart of the matter, the lie that there is such a thing as a superior race, a lie to which the colonizers were so interested in propagating, so committed to producing and reproducing. For indeed, the colonizers' sense of superiority, their sense of mission as the world's civilizers, depended on turning the other into a barbarian. The colonial encounter, in other words, required a reinvention of the colonized, what Césaire calls thingification, a dehumanization simultaneously affected, institutionalized at both the ideological and the material levels. In Césaire's pithy words, once again, between colonizer and colonized, there is room only for forced labor, intimidation, pressure, the police, taxation, theft, rape, compulsory crops, contempt, mistrust, arrogance, self-complacency, swinishness, brainless elites, degraded masses. No human contact, but relations of domination and submission, which turn the colonizing man into a classroom monitor, an army sergeant, a prison guard, a slave driver, and the indigenous man into an instrument of production. My turn to state an equation. Colonization equals thingification. In turn, such thingification also required and entailed the deliberate destruction of the African past, which is why elements of Discourse also drew on the negritude movement's counter-hegemonic impulse to recover the history of Africa's accomplishments. Thus, the references in the text to such artifacts of monumental history as the Sudanese empires, to the bronzes of Benin, to Shango sculpture and the like. Though Césaire is also careful to emphasize a more critical historical legacy as well, by claiming that pre-colonial African societies were not only anti-capitalist, but also anti-capitalist, that they were democratic societies always, that they were cooperative societies, fraternal societies, at least before they were destroyed by imperialism. In this respect, as Kelly points out, the Discourse anticipated romantic claims advanced by African nationalist leaders such as Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, not to mention Leopold Sédar Senghor, that modern Africa could establish socialism on the basis of pre-colonial village life. Césaire is, of course, emphatic in denouncing the violence and brutality, the deracination involved in the destruction of Africa's autochthonous traditions, brought about by the onset of empire. He speaks of societies drained of their essence, cultures trampled underfoot, institutions undermined, lands confiscated, religions smashed, magnificent artistic creations destroyed, extraordinary possibilities wiped out. He speaks of millions of men torn from their gods, their lands, their habits, their lives, from the dance, from wisdom. He speaks of millions of men in whom fear has been cunningly instilled, who have been taught to have an inferiority complex, to tremble, kneel, despair, and behave like flunkies. He speaks of natural economies that have been disrupted, harmonious and viable economies adopted to the indigenous population, of food crops destroyed, malnutrition permanently introduced, agricultural development oriented solely toward the benefit of the metropolitan countries, the looting of products, the looting of raw materials, a veritable tidal wave of death and destruction, no doubt. And yet, Césaire is careful to stress, his call is not for the return to an allegedly glorious but now forever lost past. To the contrary, he insists, we are not men for whom it is a question of either or. For us, the problem is not to make a utopian and sterile attempt to repeat the past, but to go beyond it. It is not a dead society that we want to revive. We leave that to those who go in for exoticism. Nor is it the present colonial society that we wish to prolong, the most putrid carrion that ever rotted under the sun. It is a new society that we must create, with the help of all our brother slaves, a society rich with all the productive power of modern times, warm with all the fraternity of olden days. Most tellingly, perhaps surprisingly, he would add, for some examples showing that this is possible, we can look to the Soviet Union. This in 1950, at the dusk of the Stalinist era, close to 15 years after the height of the purges. Césaire would end the discourse with an extended excoriation of the sins of the European bourgeoisie, followed by a proposal for an alternative order, one in principle compatible with the basic confines and contours of capitalist social property relations, an appeal for a policy of nationalities. But in the very last passage, Césaire would make it clear that for such an alternative humane order to prevail, bourgeois class rule would have to be eliminated, which is to say, the European proletariat would have to at last rise up to its historic task. It would have to at long last assume its destiny as a universal class by bringing about the revolution with the capital R. According to Césaire's poetic and prophetic vision, in his own, albeit translated cadence and words, unless in Africa, in the South Sea Islands, in Madagascar, that is at the gates of South Africa, in the West Indies, that is at the gates of America, Western Europe undertakes on its own initiative a policy of nationalities, a new policy founded on respect for peoples and cultures. Nay more, unless Europe galvanizes the dying cultures or raises up new ones, unless it becomes the awakener of countries and civilizations, Europe will have deprived itself of its last chance, and with its own hands drawn up over itself the pall of mortal darkness, which comes down to saying that the salvation of Europe is not a matter of a revolution in methods. It is a matter of the revolution, the one which, until such time as there is a classless society, will substitute for the narrow tyranny of a dehumanized bourgeoisie the preponderance of the only class that still has a universal mission, because it suffers in its flesh from all the wrongs of history, from all the universal wrongs, the proletariat. And so we see that despite his damning indictment of Europe, Césaire would not give up on his faith in the revolutionary potential of the European proletariat. For Césaire, the European proletariat remained a universal class, whose long overdue revolt was foreseen to bound to arrive imminently. He believed it would yet still prove capable of overthrowing the existing order, that it could operate in tandem, indeed, in dialectical synchrony, with the admirable resistance of the colonial peoples primarily symbolized at present by Vietnam, but also by Africa of the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, to whom Césaire also nods. A decade later, Césaire's disciple Frantz Fanon would beg to differ. In the concluding chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon would, like Césaire, recognize that the European workers had been called to shatter this European narcissism and to break with this unreality. Nevertheless, unlike Césaire, by now, at least for Fanon, it had become apparent that the European workers had proven themselves incapable of fulfilling such a historic task. In general, Fanon would contend, the workers of Europe have not replied to these calls, for the workers believe too that they are part of the prodigious adventure of the European spirit. Thus, the dialectic had been suspended in the metropole at least. Indeed, in Fanon's judgment in the last weeks of his life, by the end of 1961, today we are present at the stasis of Europe. Self-determination in the form of independence was thus the only remaining option, the only way forward. Comrades, Fanon would exhort, let us flee from this motionless motion where gradually dialectic is changing into the logic of equilibrium. And since the dialectic had died down in the metropole, the dialectic between colonizer and colonized was now destined to come to the fore, to the vanguard, so to speak. Come, brothers, Fanon would conclude, we have far too much work to do for us to play the game of rearguard. In between Césaire's profession of lingering faith in the European proletariat and Fanon's call to leave this Europe behind, in 1956, the same year as the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary, Césaire would resign from the French Communist Party, even though he would never give up his communist convictions. As Kelly aptly summarizes the letter's content, besides its stinging rebuke of Stalinism, the heart of the letter dealt with the colonial question, not just the party's policies towards the colonies, but the colonial relationship between the Metropolitan and the Martinican communist parties. Arguing that people of color need to exercise self-determination, he warned against treating the colonial question as a subsidiary part of some more important global matter. In such a vein, Césaire would insist that if following the Communist Party pillages our most vivifying friendships, breaks the bonds that weds us to the other West Indian islands, severs the tie that makes us Africa's child, then I say communism has served us ill in having us trade a living brotherhood for what seems to be the coldest of all chill abstractions. This was, for Césaire, not a matter of revindicating any narrow particularism, but rather a matter of embracing a truer, more concretely situated, less abstract, and less Eurocentric universalism. In his words, I'm not going to confine myself to some narrow particularism, but I don't intend either to become lost in a disembodied universalism. I have a different idea of a universal. It is a universal rich with all that is particular, rich with all the particulars there are, the deepening of each particular, the coexistence of them all. The question of the relation between the universal and the particular thus arises in connection with the pursuit of the goal of human emancipation. In an exchange with René Depeste that would take place a decade after his resignation from the French Communist Party, significantly at the 1967 Cultural Congress in Havana, Césaire would emphasize, Marx is all right, but we need to complete Marx. The emancipation of the Negro consists of more than just a political emancipation. Instead, he implies, it constitutes an indispensable component of the universal goal of human emancipation. The critic, scholar, and filmmaker Manthia Diawara likewise captures this often overlooked universalizing aspect of the Negritude movement, with which Césaire was so intimately associated, when she recounts retrospectively the idea that Negritude was bigger even than Africa, that we were part of an international moment which held the promise of universal emancipation, that our destiny coincided with the universal freedom of workers and colonized people worldwide. All this gave us a bigger and more important identity than the ones previously available to us through kinship, ethnicity, and race. The awareness of our new historical mission freed us from what we regarded in those days as the archaic identities of our fathers and their religious entrapments. It freed us from race and banished our fear of the whiteness of French identity. To be labeled the saviors of humanity when only recently we had been colonized and despised by the world gave us a feeling of righteousness, which bred contempt for capitalism, racialism of all origins, and tribalism. Or again, in Césaire's own words, the Negritude movement was an expression of universalizing living values that had not been exhausted. The field was not dried up. It could still bear fruit if we made the effort to irrigate it with our sweat and plant new seeds. So this was the situation. There were things to tell the world. We were not dazzled by European civilization. We bore the imprint of European civilization, but we thought that Africa could make a contribution to Europe. In this respect, there would be no significant discrepancy between Césaire and Fanon. For indeed, despite his call to leave Europe, Fanon would make it abundantly clear in the concluding chapter of The Wretched of the Earth that his was a call for a new approximation of the universal, for a new humanism. To this end, Fanon would insist that, quote, it is a question of the third world starting a new history of man, a history which will have regard to the sometimes prodigious theses which Europe has put forward, but which will also not forget its crimes. Or as C.L.R. James would put the point, explicitly appealing to and borrowing from Césaire's vocabulary, negritude is what one race brings to the common rendezvous where all will strive for the new world of the poet's vision. Such a sentiment, James would contend, amounts to a rearticulation of Marx's famous judgment and phrase that only after the abolition of capitalism, with the advent of socialism, will the real history of humanity begin. Okay, let's take a pause.